I mean, I don't think anybody in government actually cares about...
Honey, do you mind doing that somewhere else? I'm trying to watch TV.
This is how Andy Dwyer started on Parks and Rec.
Ooh-wee! Can't believe we're at Hogwarts!
No, that's Buckingham Palace.
This is how Andy Dwyer ended up on Parks and Rec. They're almost two entirely different people. How did Parks and Rec take one of the most unlikable characters on the show and turn him around into a vehicle that would make Chris Pratt a household name? Well, it's kind of a nuanced question to answer. At the time Parks and Rec was in production, Chris Pratt's largest roles were supporting characters in things like Wanted and a 10-part line in Jennifer's Body. He was relatively unknown at the time, and his role as Andy Dwyer on Parks and Rec was never meant to really go anywhere beyond the show's first season. He's credited as a guest star throughout, and public sentiment around Andy Dwyer's character throughout the first season could be summed up as wildly unlikable. So how did this selfish, lazy loser end up becoming a romantic lead that audiences were actively rooting for? And why wasn't he working to begin with? Andy Dwyer was initially intended to be, well, almost an antagonist to Rashida Jones' character Anne Perkins. In the first season of Parks and Rec, Andy Dwyer's function as a character was really nothing more than to give audiences someone to hate while playing the foil to Anne's burgeoning relationship with Mark throughout the season. The point here is that Andy Dwyer begins his journey as basically just a parasite, leeching off of Anne's good nature. So, when Anne starts playfully flirting with Mark, you're really rooting for her to leave Andy. Andy is, at his core, a douche. He certainly wasn't built to be loved. And this works well in advancing and developing Anne's character throughout that season, right up until the point where Anne finally breaks up with Andy at the end of the season, and we see a completion of this sort of initial development arc. She finds the strength within herself to ditch an emotionally manipulative and somewhat abusive loser and ends up developing a romantic connection with someone much more suited to her needs. This moment, this set of actions, is what the whole season was building up to. And this moment isn't revolutionary, it's certainly not the best character development ever put to screen, but it's still a good moment for Anne. And Anne's breakup with Andy could have, and probably should have, ended Andy's involvement in the overall storyline of Parks and Rec. It would have been much easier just to write the character off then and there and move on with the story, maybe bring him back as a guest a couple of more times throughout the seasons. But that's not what happened. It's a well-known fact that the writers and producers of Parks and Rec loved the character of Andy Dwyer so much that they decided to make him a series regular moving forward. But from a character perspective and a writing perspective, that wasn't an easy process. Funny enough, a very similar thing happened to The Office with Andy Bernard. Just a strange coincidence, but a similar set of hurdles to overcome. Andy Dwyer was, up until this point, written with almost zero redeeming qualities. A shiftless layabout with a propensity for emotionally manipulating his romantic partner to an almost problematic degree. So without Anne to exploit, Andy Dwyer really had little reason to pop onto screens. Writers really had tried the screenwriting equivalent of brute force in an attempt to get this character to stick. In fact, they almost made him even more aggressively unlikable by effectively setting him up as a creepy stalker who lives in a tent inside of a gigantic hole in the ground outside of Anne's home, where he can intersect with her life at his own will.
Every day, I subtly chip away at their relationship, weakening it little by little.
This essentially amplifies everything about Andy Dwyer that made him a villain to begin with and takes it to 11, creating what some call a punishment character in screenwriting. A person on paper and eventually on screen simply designed to punish and act as karmic retribution. Typically, these kind of characters are used to add insult to injury. They might not be the initial obstacle, but they're there to kick someone when they're down, to make the comeback that eventually happens all the more dramatic and all the more exciting.
Oh, whoa. 5-second rule. No.
However, in this instance, having Andy living in her backyard, monitoring her every move, takes Andy's character out of the realm of funny idiot and moves it into the realm of borderline psychotic. Andy Dwyer was not working on paper or on screen after his breakup with Anne. He was Park and Rec's weird version of Oscar the Grouch until Leslie Knope dumped a ton of dirt on his head and sent him to the hospital in season 2.
What the?
However, it's in this moment where the character of Andy Dwyer begins turning around. The decision to fill in the hole was kind of a nuanced approach to solving an even more nuanced problem. It was both a figurative and literal message. It eliminated Andy's stranglehold over Anne's character by taking him out of her life. It was the final kick to the face of Andy's character, and it marked a shift in how the show would operate and its modus operandi moving forward. And it was all visual, it was all represented clearly. From a literal standpoint, the decision to have Parks and Rec's department be responsible for injuring Andy in the process helps the audience gain sympathy for his character. This sympathy is driven even further by the introduction of these monstrous attorneys who keep yanking Leslie and Andy in different directions. They take it even further in this episode by having Andy turn down a $100,000 settlement, which adds a bit of selflessness and altruism to the recipe of this character. In fact, by the end of the episode, we really care about what's happening to Andy.
You always hated this pit!
If Andy was built as somewhat of a punishment variable in the scripts, all it seemed to have taken was flipping those roles, much like Andy Bernard and his anger management moment in The Office. You might notice that some screenwriting realities seem to repeat themselves in similar situations. With the audience now warm and relatively sympathetic to Andy, the writers were effectively able to slowly transition him to a more permanent role on the show by having Leslie offer him a job shining shoes at Pawnee City Hall. It's during his time there that Andy begins developing his romantic relationship with April and cementing his presence. The problem with Andy weren't finished there. There was still a lot of reconciliation to do with his character's past behaviors, but the writers did a really fantastic job at delivering some comeuppance with his character while still creating space for him to grow and redeem himself. He still has some unexplored feelings for Anne that get in the way of developing his relationship with April, and the two sort of exist in a will they won't they for a while. But they do such a good job of these aforementioned things that by the end of the second season, Andy, who was a character designed to prop up the intended romantic lead of Mark, becomes a much more likable romantic lead than Mark could have ever been. As we stated in a previous video, Andy Dwyer becoming such an impactful romantic lead was one of the components that led to Mark effectively being written off the show, which is a huge dose of screenwriting irony. It takes the remainder of the second season for Andy to get there, and it really speaks to the quality of the writing on that show, even in its infancy, that they were able to turn this around so quickly. Andy was a happy accident, an accident we might add that was absolutely quintessential to Chris Pratt becoming one of the biggest names in Hollywood. Sometimes characters are created, and writers can't help but fall in love with them. And when a writer does fall in love with a character, they begin writing that character from a place of love. And when the writing starts coming from that place, the audience recognizes it. The result commonly is that the character ends up sticking around and enhancing the show. This is something that we've seen with characters like Fonzie from Happy Days or Steve Urkel, who essentially took over the entirety of Family Matters to the point of almost turning a blue-collar family sitcom into a sci-fi comedy. In the case of Parks and Rec, which was essentially on the same track as The Office, writers saw the opportunity to diverge from a path of proven success and take a risk on a character who needed a lot of work. Or so on the surface it seems, but it really was the same process we saw over on that show. And I don't want to generalize the point here, and I don't want to wrap this video up by giving you some Pinterest board thing about writers needing to adapt, because that's not actually what I think is important here. What I think is actually more interesting is Hollywood's propensity for falling in love with the villain. And I don't mean the audience, I mean the writers themselves. I don't want to psychoanalyze why, but what I do want to point out is that writing a bad guy doesn't always mean you're writing a bad guy. It means you're writing a character with flaws that manifest themselves a little bit differently than they maybe should. But that doesn't mean you give them less care than the characters that you want to overcome that villain. Well guys, that's it for today's episode of Nerdstalgic. If you enjoyed this one, press the like button down below. If you haven't yet done so, also hit subscribe. And on your screen right now are 2 more episodes of Nerdstalgic. You can click on either of those as well. Stay here, and hopefully I'll see you guys in the next video.